Chapter 2. Krelekar. K'chak! Joran's mouth snaps open wide in silent shock. Pain contorts his body into a stiff, shuddering mockery of the proud warrior he was just a moment ago. The intensity of the pain is so great, his body can't even conceive of sparing the effort to use his voice. He strains to look down and sees his left leg mangled at mid-calf, caught in the grips of huge metal teeth sprouting from a sinister-looking mechanical jaw. Joran's high-impact polycarbonate anti-projectile body armor buckled and snapped like a twig against the multi-ton force of the machine's vicious bite. A bite carefully designed to prevent Joran's lower leg from being severed, leaving him trapped, stopped at the corner of an intersection just as he was leaving the shelter of the glass and steel office building behind him. Now, highly visible and vulnerable, Joran stands crippled, immobilized, and ineffective. A tragic example of the immense cost of this siege. He stares in mute horror at his dark green lifeblood spilling freely down his leg, over the walkway, and onto the black plasticrete of the pre-dawn, rain-washed street. Distant, thunderous booms echo throughout the darkness in the vast, suburban sprawl outside the city proper, as thousands of vehicles and countless thousands of Joran's comrades hustle into the war zone from hastily erected PRF gates. Joran, however, is oblivious to his surroundings as a barely noticeable sting surges into a breath-stealing torment climbing through his ragged wound. His panicked mind reels, and somewhere beyond his suffering, a small part of him becomes offended at being caught like a stupid animal in a foothold trap. A foothold trap! And not only that, but the bastard trap maker had the gall to poison the teeth. Joran gets little chance to stoke the indignant fires of his distant outrage before his jaw pops open with a sharp rise in his pain. And now Joran screams, a heart-stopping, soul-jarring wail. Every warrior in the area takes a few steps away, terrified, sapped of whatever confidence they had earlier by the sight of Joran's contorted body thrashing around in primal agony. Watching the drama unfold on vidcast from the comfortable safety of orbit, a broad, toothy grin spreads across Krelekar's meticulously groomed face. His cordovan skin flushes a deeper red with delight. Sometimes a simple contraption is the best way to achieve the desired effect. Approximately 1.5 years ago, Krelekar had come across several news items highlighting the escalating political tensions between the two largest city-states on the giant, lush planet of Wagosha. Wagosha's surface was over 85% water, and the mostly blue-skinned amphibious Hethwith viewed land living as a privilege for the higher classes. Accordingly, the small amount of land that did exist above the waves was greatly valued, hard-won, and jealously guarded. Large-scale conflict was terribly common on Wagosha, and in this case, the inevitability of war was palpable. Krelekar immediately booked passage on a bulk goods trade ship bound for Bossamarl's spaceport. Together, Central and Outer Bossamarl were considered Wagosha's glittering twins of tomorrow. This was due to the endless number of towering glass and steel skyscrapers, the cutting-edge architecture, and the conscientiously tended streets of the megalopolis. Its city services were second to none, and its cultural diversions were rated galaxy class. Outer Bossamarl surrounded the roughly circular and walled Central Bossamarl like an immense sparkling ring around a giant, dazzling finger. Having a total population of around 70 million beings, the city-state of Bossamarl was the second largest urban area above the waves on Wagosha. Matapum, by contrast, was a sprawling conurbation of striking extremes. Some of the most obscenely rich and powerful beings in the sector lived here in seclusion, concentrated in small, scattered districts of licentious wealth. While outside these isolated oases, vast sections of the prodigious city had long ago withered into forlorn slums. It had been this way for centuries, and there was little chance it would ever change. Nevertheless, Matapum was considered grand. The expansive kingdom drew multitudes of romantics, entrepreneurs, rebels and outlaws, hustlers, innovators, con artists, entertainers, gamblers, and dreamers from every planet in the Wedge to find their fortunes in Matapum's gritty streets. In Matapum, anything was possible, and almost everything was legal. It was the largest city above the waves on Wagosha, boasting a population of well over 100 million beings, and they constantly desired more. As the smaller of the two nations in the highly publicized conflict, Basamarl was widely expected to surrender its claim on two islands off the coast of its northern border. There, rich veins of precious metals lay only partly mined due to the decades-long territorial dispute with neighboring Matapum. Matapum had greater resources than Basamarl. Matapum had the greatest presence in the Allied Order of Nations on Wagosha, and Matapum was the world's chief diplomatic body for interplanetary relations. More importantly, however, Matapum had the world's largest standing army. And on Wagosha, where distance-based military tactics had been made irrelevant by regional energy shields, orbital defense platforms, and a plethora of atmospheric defense systems, ground-based armies had regained prominence in wartime scenarios as the final and most honorable way to resolve international conflict. In the past, arguments, bluffs, and political ploys had gone back and forth with Basamarl and Matapum coming to the brink of war several times. But Wagosha's Allied Order of Nations always intervened, and level heads prevailed. The present was different. In Matapum, the Defenders of Matapum, or TDM, a fringe political group with extreme views and a lust for power, gained widespread popularity. Their charismatic but young and rash chairman, Yisso Vagantes, led TDM to Matapum's capital and brutally took the presidency by force. As Matapum's new ruler, Vagantes was bound to have his name go down in history as the Hethwu, who once and for all laid waste to Basamarl's claims on the disputed island territories, if not to Basamarl itself. Predictably, the war drums grew ever louder during the first few months of Vagantes' governance. He repeatedly refused every effort at conciliation and compromise, loudly declaring that Basamarl had 2 Wagoshan years to retract any and all claims on the disputed metal-rich islands and permanently withdraw its forces from the area. If, at the end of 2 years, Basamarl hadn't conceded to its demands, then Matapum would cleanse the islands of Basamarl's forces, scuttle its navy, and proceed to invade the sovereign state of Basamarl itself to eliminate any future threat of conflict. Matapum's public rallied fanatically behind its new leader. The Allied Order of Nations withdrew all its agents from Matapum, and Matapum severed all its diplomatic ties in return. On the other side of the territorial dispute, Basamarl's public rallied behind its leader, the People's Supreme Director, Engdragad Tinadar. A timid man, Tinadar was globally seen as a puppet whose strings were controlled by Basamarl's military, but the people of Basamarl adored him. And even though he was openly opposed to war and would under no circumstances attack Matapum, Tinadar refused time and again to submit to the other nations' ultimatums. Tinadar even refused, if meekly, any and all aid from the Allied Order of Nations. He declared that Basamarl, on its own, would overcome any aggression from Matapum, adding as taunt and threat that if Matapum persisted in its belligerent ways, then soon enough the people of Basamarl would possess Wagosha's largest standing army. The Allied Order of Nations looked on in dismay, declaiming both sovereign states with impotent outrage. Seeing another opportunity to make a fortune, which had eluded him thus far, Krelekar picked Basamarl to side with. Hundreds of other mercenaries were arriving on Wagosha daily, each choosing to offer his, her, UD's, or its particular services to Basamarl or to Matapum for a variety of reasons, but mostly they came for the promise of wealth, the spoils of war. Krelekar, like many other mercenaries, chose to side with Basamarl in part because he always rooted for the underdog in a fight. His more practical reason, though, was that he recognized his own genius with his particularly unique talents. Krelekar was an engineer. More specifically, Krelekar specialized in designing fortifications and remote defensive measures, or RDMs, trammels, snares, hazards, traps. He figured If he could successfully aid Basamarl in repelling Madapum's impending invasion of overwhelming forces and gain notoriety for his innovative RDMs, he would not only receive a great deal of pay and praise from Basamarl's top brass, but, as news of his work spread throughout the Wedge, he would have no shortage of commissions to choose from in the future. Krelekar arrived in Basamarl with a little over 1 Wagoshan year to spare before Madapum's declared invasion would begin. He prepared to labor under Wagosha's legendary gravity, being 4 times the galactic norm, and bought an affordable, third-rate power assist body frame. With a little customization during the long flight from a distant PRF gate to the giant planet, his discount power assist body frame became more than adequate to handle Wagosha's massive pull. Upon landing, Krelekar gathered his few things and sought out the recruitment center for the People's Army of Basamarl. Once there, he patiently endured being mocked by the People's Army of Basamarl's recruiter. Sadly, it is what he had come to expect after all the open ridicule he experienced at Basamarl's spaceport. You see, Hethwith were huge, which surprised Krelekar at first. He'd seen pics and vids of them, of course, but even still, he expected them to be bulky, short, and squat due to Wagosha's severe gravity. And they were bulky, yes, but not short or squat in the least. Hethwith were incredibly tall, a very imposing race of people. Krelekar, on the other hand, was a slight little man as far as human beings were commonly viewed. His large, bony head with its broad, intelligent brow sat on top of a serpentine neck connected to a body that was thin and sinuous. It almost seemed as if he had no joints. And with little visible muscle definition and only the suggestion of a skeletal structure in his lithe form, Krelekar looked as if he was constructed out of a single, diminutive, elastic muscle. Compounding this impression of smallness was his height. At 145 centimeters tall, which he always thought of as the perfect size, Krelekar was well below the average height of wedge-born humans, and humans themselves were a bit smaller than the galactic average. So the recruiter for the People's Army of Basamarl had a field day when he saw the little whittle alien come to help his nation repel the Madapuma menace. His name was First Assistant Overseer of Recruitment, Tig, and Krelekar decided he would have to make an example of him. Eventually, the little human found a long enough pause in Recruiter Tig's harangue to clearly state that he hadn't come to Basamarl to join the infantry, but the engineers. After a few more choice words from Recruiter Tig, Krelekar was finally directed to the People's Corps of Engineers for evaluation. In the offices for the People's Corps of Engineers, Krelekar was first asked to explain his mechanical body frame. "Most certainly," he replied, and after describing its purpose and detailing the modifications he'd made, Krelekar impressed the People's Corps of Engineers recruiter enough to be accepted on the spot, without a test, and he was assigned to the engineers' general quarters within Basamarl's impressive 20-meter-high electro-reactive titanium outer walls. There, Krelekar made his way around the mostly Hethwuthu engineers in the enormous room and found a bunk near one of the 2 exits. Later that night, after lights out, Krelekar, with his sack of tools, snuck into the private quarters of First Assistant Overseer of Recruitment, Tig. The door locks were child's play, and not long after rerouting the room's security cameras into a continuous image loop of Recruiter Tig sleeping from 10 minutes earlier, Krelekar found himself sitting on the giant's chest, pressing chemical cocktail-soaked cloths firmly against Recruiter Tig's nose and mouth. The following morning, when Recruiter Tig didn't show up for exercises, his commanding officer went to his quarters to find out why. Soon thereafter, a warrant was issued for Krelekar's arrest. Not long after that, 2 of the People's Army of Basamarl's police force pulled a mischievously smiling Krelekar out of the engineer's early planning session, arrested him, and threw him in the brig. The officers then summoned the junior technician of the People's Corps of Engineers to assess the situation in the First Assistant Overseer of Recruitment's quarters. Sometime in the middle of the night, Tig awoke with a strange taste in his mouth and a burning compulsion to clear his bowels. He jumped up, ran to his private latrine, and sat on the toilet seat. A pressure trigger clicked, snapped. Clamps snapped out with blinding speed. Pulleys whined, and cables whipped and pulled taut. Clothes ripped, muscles tore, cartilage cracked, and bones broke. When Recruiter Tig was found later that morning, he was pinned to the wall over his toilet. A length of thick steel cable was pulled across the front of his throat, and his knuckles bulged white with the effort it took to keep the cable from choking him to death. Each of his labored breaths launched puffs of spittle from his froth-covered mouth. His swollen eyes quivered and searched without focus, while inky green blood slowly washed the cracked tiles on the wall behind Recruiter Tig's immobilized head. Lower down, his legs were spread wide and clamped to anchors just below the knee, as if he'd been stapled to the wall in the act of doing the splits. His underwear was ripped in half and hung in tatters from his thighs. Strange lumps bulged under the skin around his groin, and the messy contents of his bowels were splashed all over the toilet and the floor below. The junior technician summoned assistance. A small group of the People's Corps of Engineers had gone over the room with meticulous care and realized in short order that the sprung trap had been rigged with several tamper triggers. The small group of engineers just as carefully exited the room. Not one of them was eager to begin the search for signs of any secondary traps and accidentally become another victim. And the good news was, they knew they didn't have to. A greeting on the vanity mirror opposite the ensnared Recruiter Tig gave light to a solution. Written neatly in grease pencil, it simply read, "Best regards, Krelekar Cholem." 2 hours later, a mischievously smiling Krelekar was pulled from the brig and escorted to the private quarters of First Assistant Overseer of Recruitment, Tig. Word of Recruiter Tig's predicament had intrigued the entire department, and every engineer had managed to invent a reason to be present. Still pinned to the wall, Recruiter Tig glared at them all with a tortured mosaic of emotions twisting his face. When everyone worth impressing had arrived, Krelekar began dismantling the trap. By the time he finished explaining its complexities, its triggers, and its construction, he had completely won over the principal technician and the rest of the senior staff of the People's Corps of Engineers. With Basamaral's urgent need for a prevailing defense against Matapum in mind, and with Krelekar's contracted agreement to oppose their enemy's aggression with all his abilities, the diminutive human was spared any further discipline for the incident. In the meanwhile, First Assistant Overseer of Recruitment Tig was treated at the hospital for the People's Army of Basamaral and honorably discharged due to his severe injuries. Word of Krelekar's misdeed and Recruiter Tig's misfortune spread throughout Basamaral's military operations faster than Krelekar could have imagined. Within days, no Hethwith gave him even the slightest hint of derision. Some even gave him open praise for his pluck, in spite of his size. The little engineer took it all in with that same mischievous downturned smile of his. In less than a week, Krelekar's influence began to weigh heavily on the configuration of Basamaral's mechanical defenses for the coming invasion. In less than a month, his word was second only to the principal technician of the People's Corps of Engineers. The Wagoshan year passed much too quickly for the citizens of Basamaral as Matapum's deadline rapidly approached. And while fully confident in his plans for Basamaral's defenses, Krelekar's pragmatism always took precedence when faced with danger. In the case of war, you couldn't underestimate the enemy, its spies, or its plans. The galaxy was a big place, and you never knew what other brilliant minds had come to Wagosha to profit from all this strife. Accordingly, and several days before Matapum's deadline, Krelekar fled Basamaral as a stowaway on a ship sent to retrieve the few remaining Basamaral soldiers from one of Wagosha's orbital defense platforms. These gigantic, amorphous, space-built superstructures were bristling with weapons, sparsely manned by Wagosha's allied order of nations, and were almost completely automated. It would be ridiculously easy to avoid being detected by the 20 Hethwith stationed up there during the invasion. Once on board the platform, Krelekar was sure he'd be missed, but Matapum's deadline was too close now for the top brass of the People's Army of Basamaral to waste time looking for one little engineer. He'd return to the surface after Basamaral turned back the Matapumas. Then, he could enjoy his colleagues' adoration and collect the victory bonus to add to his already hefty pay as First Assistant Technician of the People's Corps of Engineers. Nestled in one of the loaded and forgotten storage compartments of the colossal Wagosha Defense Platform 5, Krelekar shakes himself from his reverie. When he first arrived on the enormous ship, he spent a day or two remaking the storage room into his den. The compartment was now a plush and comfortable living space, set up with a water feed and even a waste removal system that tapped into the main sewage recycling line. All he ever needed to leave for was food, and there was enough of that stored on this particular station for the crew of 20 plus Krelekar to live easily for at least 4 years. On the day of Matapum's deadline, Krelekar remotely hacked into Wagosha's World Newsnet, the People's Army of Basamarl's satellite beam, the defenders of Matapum's private signal, and surveillance feeds in and around the glittering Twins of Tomorrow. Once the invasion began, he had the best of all views. Returning his attention to the mammoth encroachment below, he finds it fitting that the layout of the besieged city resembles a spider's web.